My sister ruptured my abdomen. My own flesh and blood kicked me so hard that I felt something inside me snap a white-hot agony that stole the very air from my lungs. As I lay gasping on the cold floor clutching my stomach, while my vision blurred into darkness, my mother didn't reach for the phone to call 911. Instead, she leaned down, her breath smelling of expensive wine, and whispered into my ear, "Stay quiet, Cassandra. Don't you dare ruin this night. Your sister has a future at Juilliard, and your drama won't be the headline tomorrow. I'm Cassandra Vance." I'm 24 years old, and that was the moment I realized that in my family's eyes, my life was just collateral damage for my sister's success. The physical pain of a ruptured organ was suffocating, but the betrayal was what truly paralyzed me. They were willing to let me bleed out internally just to protect a reputation built on lies. But what my parents didn't count on was the man waiting in the ER, a doctor who looked at the bruises, looked straight into my shattered soul, and refused to stay silent. He didn't just save my life, he ignited a war. Before I tell you how I dismantled the prestigious Vance dynasty piece by piece, let me know in the comments, have you ever been forced to sacrifice yourself for a golden child? And if you believe that no one is too powerful to face justice, hit that subscribe button right now. You're part of a family here that stands for the truth. Life in Greenwich, Connecticut is often measured by the height of your iron gates and the silence of your neighbors. My family lived in a sprawling colonial estate that looked like a postcard for the American dream, but inside those whitewashed walls, the air was heavy with the suffocating scent of lilies and unspoken rules. My father, Arthur Vance, was a man who viewed his family not as human beings with beating hearts, but as curated exhibits in his high-end art galleries. Everything had to be pristine, expensive, and above all, perfect. He spent his days trading oil paintings for millions, but at home he was the architect of a hierarchy that placed me at the very bottom. To Arthur, a daughter was only as valuable as the prestige she brought to the family name, and in his eyes I was a constant disappointment because I chose the gritty world of law over the polished stage of the arts. Then there was Sabrina Vance, my older sister, and the undisputed son around which my parents' universe revolved. Sabrina was a piano prodigy, a hauntingly beautiful girl who could make a Steinway weep, but her music was the only thing about her that possessed any soul. Off-stage, she was a master of a different craft, a cold, calculated narcissism that my parents fed with gold-plated spoons. Growing up, I wasn't just her sister. I was her shadow, the person meant to absorb her tantrums and amplify her light. If Sabrina won a competition, we celebrated for weeks. If I aced a difficult exam at law school, it was merely an expectation fulfilled, barely worth a nod over the morning coffee. The divide between us wasn't just about talent, it was about the roles we were forced to play. I was the scapegoat, the one who asked too many questions and refused to perform for the cameras during the charity galas my mother Eleanor hosted with terrifying precision. As I pushed deeper into my legal internship trying to carve out a life that didn't involve bowing to the Vance legacy, the tension in the house began to thicken like a brewing storm. Sabrina didn't like my newfound independence. She viewed my autonomy as a personal insult, a crack in the mirror she used to admire herself. The psychological warfare started small. A glass of water, accidentally, spilled over my law textbooks, or subtle whispers to my father about how my career path was embarrassing for a family of their stature. I remember one evening while I was preparing for a mock trial, Sabrina walked into my room without knocking. She didn't say a word at first, just stood there staring at me with an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. She picked up my heavy constitutional law book, weighing it in her hand, before dropping it onto my foot with a sickening thud. "You think you're going to be someone, Cassandra?" She hissed, her voice devoid of its usual melodic charm. "You're just the help that happened to share our DNA. Don't forget where you belong." Arthur and Eleanor watched these interactions with a practiced, chilling indifference. To them, Sabrina's growing aggression was just the fire of a genius, something to be tolerated, because her hands were destined to play in the great halls of Europe. They ignored the bruises on my spirit, and eventually the subtle shoves in the hallway, choosing to believe the lie that our family was a fortress of unity. I was becoming a stranger in my own home, a target for a sister who couldn't stand anyone sharing her spotlight, and a daughter to a father who only cared about the frame, never the person inside it. The evening of the celebration arrived with a chilling elegance that only the Vance family could orchestrate. Our Connecticut estate was transformed into a cathedral of high society, filled with the soft hum of a string quartet and the clinking of crystal glasses as the elite gathered to toast Sabrina's full scholarship to Juilliard. Looking at her draped in a silk gown that cost more than most people's yearly rent, you would never have guessed the darkness that simmered beneath her porcelain skin. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, acting as the dutiful younger sister, while Arthur and Eleanor beamed with a pride they had never once directed toward me. But as the night wore on, the pressure of maintaining her perfect image began to grate on Sabrina's fragile nerves, and the facade finally shattered in the silence of our massive kitchen. I had slipped away from the noise to grab a glass of water, hoping for a moment of peace, when Sabrina stormed in her face, twisted in a silent, vibrating rage. Apparently, a guest had dared to ask about my legal internship, momentarily shifting the spotlight away from her piano prowess. "You just couldn't let me have this one night, could you, Cassandra?" She hissed the music from the ballroom, muffled by the heavy oak doors. I tried to stay calm, keeping my voice low, as I replied that I hadn't even spoken to the guest for more than a minute, but logic was a foreign language to her in that state. She paced the marble floor, her breathing becoming shallow and jagged until she suddenly lunged forward. Before I could react, Sabrina's hand shot out, gripping my shoulder with a strength born of pure adrenaline, and then it happened. She swung her leg with a precision that was terrifyingly athletic. The sharp, pointed heel of her designer stiletto caught me squarely in the upper abdomen, sinking deep into the soft tissue with a sickening force. The impact sent me flying backward, my body colliding with the razor-sharp edge of a wrought iron decorative cabinet. A dull, heavy thud echoed through the room as my back hit the metal, but that was nothing compared to the explosion of agony that erupted in my gut. It wasn't just pain. It was a total system failure. For several seconds, the world went completely silent. I tried to inhale, but my lungs refused to expand, trapped by a localized paralysis that felt like my internal organs were being crushed in a hydraulic press. I slid down the side of the cabinet, my hands instinctively clutching my stomach, as a terrifying, searing heat began to spread through my midsection. It felt as though something vital had been torn open inside me, a hot, liquid sensation that signaled a disaster I couldn't see. My vision began to fray at the edges, dissolving into erratic bursts of white light, and a metallic taste flooded my mouth. I tried to call for help, but all that emerged was a pathetic wet wheeze. Sabrina stood over me, her chest heaving, her eyes wide, not with regret, but with a terrifyingly cold curiosity. She looked down at my crumpled form as if I were a piece of sheet music she had accidentally torn. I watched through a haze of tears as she straightened her gown, her hands trembling slightly, yet she made no move to kneel beside me or check if I was breathing. The agony intensified, radiating from the point of impact and wrapping around my spine like a coil of barbed wire. Every heartbeat felt like a hammer blow against a raw nerve, and I could feel my consciousness slipping, a heavy curtain of gray pulling me toward the floor. I was drowning in a sea of velvet and iron, the distant sound of applause from the ballroom serving as a cruel soundtrack to my internal collapse. My fingers pressed hard against my abdomen, could feel the unnatural swelling already beginning, a tight, rigid pressure that told me I was bleeding where no one could see. I looked up at my sister, the pride of the Vance family, and realized that to her, my life was nothing more than a minor discord in her grand symphony. The woman who had just ruptured my future stood there in the golden light of the kitchen, waiting for me to stop making noise so she could return to her standing ovation. The heavy oak doors of the kitchen creaked open, but it wasn't the paramedics I so desperately prayed for. It was Eleanor and Arthur Vance looking more annoyed than concerned. My mother took one look at my pale, trembling form on the floor and then at the spot of blood on the marble, her face instantly tightening into a mask of cold efficiency. Instead of kneeling to check my pulse, she grabbed a roll of paper towels and began scrubbing the floor with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. "We have the dean of admissions from the university in the other room, Cassandra." She hissed, her voice a jagged whisper that cut deeper than any physical wound. "Do you have any idea what a scene like this would do to Sabrina's reputation? You're always so dramatic, seeking attention at the most inconvenient times." I tried to tell her that I couldn't breathe, that my stomach felt like it was filled with molten lead, but my father stepped forward, his shadow looming over me like a dark monument. Arthur didn't offer a hand to help me up. Instead, he adjusted his cufflinks and looked at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, his tone low and dangerous. "You are going to get up, go to your room, and stay there until every single guest has left this house. If you utter a word about this accident, or try to call anyone, I will personally ensure that your law school tuition is cut off by tomorrow morning. You want to be a lawyer? Start practicing by keeping your mouth shut." They grabbed me by the arms, dragging my limp body toward the back staircase like a piece of unwanted furniture. Every movement sent a fresh wave of agony radiating through my ruptured abdomen, making me see stars behind my eyelids. They threw me into my bedroom, and I heard the sickening click of the lock from the outside. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the pain. The distant sound of laughter and piano music from downstairs served as a grim reminder that my life was worth less than a polished performance. For an hour, I lay on the rug, my body shivering despite the summer heat. The gaslighting was working. For a moment, I wondered if I was truly just exaggerating. But then I felt a strange cold dampness spreading beneath my shirt, and when I pulled my hand away, it was stained a deep, frightening crimson. The internal pressure was becoming unbearable, a bloating sensation that made every shallow breath feel like a knife twist. I realized then with a chilling clarity that if I stayed in this room waiting for my parents' permission to be hurt, I would be leaving this house in a body bag. Survival instinct, raw and primal, took over the fear. I dragged myself toward the window, my fingernails digging into the hardwood floors as I bypassed the locked door. The colonial estate had a decorative trellis just outside my room, and with a strength I didn't know I possessed, I forced myself over the ledge. The drop was only a few feet to the lower roof, but the impact felt like an explosion inside my gut. I bit my lips so hard it bled to keep from screaming, the metallic taste of blood mixing with the salty sweat on my face. I scrambled down the side of the house, hidden by the shadows of the manicured hedges, and made it to my old sedan parked at the edge of the driveway. My vision was beginning to tunnel, dark spots dancing at the periphery like swarms of insects. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so violently I nearly dropped them twice. As I pulled out of the gates of the Vance estate, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. The house was glowing with warmth and light, a beautiful lie, shielding a family of monsters. I drove through the winding roads of Greenwich, my foot heavy on the pedal even as my head began to swim. The steering wheel felt slippery in my grip, and the road ahead blurred into a hazy gray ribbon, but I refused to stop. I was driving for my life, leaving behind the velvet cage and the people who would rather see me die than see their golden child fail. The fluorescent lights of the Central Hospital emergency room blurred into long, distorted streaks of white as I stumbled through the sliding glass doors. The cold air hit my face, but it felt like ice on an open flame, doing nothing to dampen the agonizing heat radiating from my midsection. I didn't have the strength to reach the reception desk. My legs simply gave out, and the linoleum floor rushed up to meet me. As the world began to fade into a dark, narrow tunnel, a pair of strong hands caught me before my head hit the ground. A calm, authoritative voice cut through the ringing in my ears, calling for a gurney and a trauma team. That was the first time I saw Dr. Julian Sterling, a man whose steady gaze and unwavering composure would soon become my only anchor in a world that had tried to drown me. "Stay with me, Cassandra," he whispered, his eyes scanning my face with a professional intensity that was devoid of the judgment I had endured all my life. I was rushed into a brightly lit trauma bay where the smell of antiseptic and the frantic beeping of monitors replaced the distant piano music of my parents' house. When Julian lifted my shirt to examine the injury, I heard a collective intake of breath from the nurses. The stiletto-shaped bruise was a dark, angry purple, and my abdomen was rigid, a classic sign of massive internal damage. "I need an ultrasound and a surgical suite prepped right now." He barked, his voice leaving no room for hesitation. "We're looking at a probable organ rupture and significant internal bleeding." The next few hours were a haze of anesthesia and the cold metallic clang of surgical instruments. When I finally drifted back to consciousness, the harsh glare of the morning sun was filtering through the hospital blinds. Julian was sitting in a chair by my bed, looking at a clipboard with a deep furrow in his brow. The moment he saw my eyes open, he stood up and moved to my side, his expression softening just enough to let me know I was no longer a target. "The surgery was successful, Cassandra." He began, his voice low and firm. "You had a severe laceration to your spleen and significant trauma to your abdominal wall. Another hour of waiting and the internal hemorrhaging would have been fatal." I tried to swallow my throat, feeling like it was lined with sandpaper, and I felt a tear slip down my temple. I started to stammer out a lie, some rehearsed story about falling down the stairs or tripping over a rug, but Julian held up a hand to stop me. He leaned in closer, looking straight into my eyes with a piercing clarity that demanded the truth. "Don't," he said, and for the first time in my life, a man spoke to me with genuine protection. "I've been a trauma surgeon for 15 years. I know the difference between a fall and a focused high-velocity impact. This was a deliberate strike. You're safe now, but I need you to understand that I cannot and will not let this go." Before I could respond, the door to the recovery room swung open and a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase tried to push past the nursing station. It was one of my father's high-priced corporate attorneys sent to handle the situation before it could escalate. He began speaking in a rapid, hushed tone about non-disclosure agreements and the private nature of family matters, even hinting at a significant donation to the hospital's research fund if Julian would just classify the injury as an accidental fall. Julian didn't even let him finish. He stood up, his tall frame dwarfing the lawyer, and his voice turned to liquid steel. "You have exactly 10 seconds to exit this ward before I have security remove you and add your name to the police report I am currently filing." Julian stated, his face a mask of righteous fury. "I don't care who Arthur Vance is or how much money he has. My patient was nearly killed, and I will not be complicit in a cover-up. The authorities are on their way." The lawyer retreated, his face pale, but the victory felt hollow as the reality of what was coming began to sink in. Julian turned back to me, his hand resting briefly on the bed railing. "He tried to buy my silence," he said quietly. "But your life isn't for sale. I've already documented everything, Cassandra. The marks on your body tell a story your parents tried to bury, and I'm going to make sure the world finally hears it." For the first time, I felt a spark of something other than pain. I felt the cold, hard weight of impending justice. The sterile peace of my recovery room lasted less than an hour before the storm arrived, in the form of designer heels and polished Oxfords. I heard Eleanor's sharp, frantic voice before the door even swung open, arguing with a nurse about family privacy and unnecessary drama. When my parents finally burst inside, they didn't rush to my bedside with tears of relief or ask how the surgery had gone. Instead, Arthur Vance stood at the foot of my bed, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and calculated desperation, holding a stack of legal documents that looked like a death warrant for my dignity. Eleanor didn't even look at the surgical drains coming out of my side. She was too busy checking the hallway to ensure no one was eavesdropping on our private matter. "You've really done it this time, Cassandra." Arthur began his voice a low, vibrating growl that made my fresh stitches throb. "The police are already asking questions because your doctor has a hero complex. You are going to sign these papers immediately stating that you tripped on the garden trellis while sneaking out and that Sabrina was never even in the kitchen." He tossed the pen onto my lap, the plastic clicking against my bruised skin. I looked at the document, a comprehensive liability waiver and a non-disclosure agreement that would legally bind me to a lie forever. The sheer coldness of it was breathtaking. They weren't here to comfort their daughter who had nearly bled to death. They were here to sanitize a crime scene. Just as Arthur leaned over me to force the pen into my hand, the door opened again, and Dr. Julian Sterling walked in, flanked by 2 uniformed officers from the Greenwich Police Department. My father's demeanor shifted instantly, his back straightening, as he adopted the persona of a grieving, wealthy benefactor. He stepped toward Julian, lowering his voice to a tone he usually reserved for closing multi-million-dollar art deals. "Dr. Sterling, I think there's been a massive misunderstanding," Arthur said, reaching into his suit pocket and pulling out a checkbook. "My family is immensely grateful for your skill. I'd like to make a personal donation of $50,000 to your surgical department's research fund today. All I ask in return is that we handle this unfortunate accident with the discretion a family of our standing deserves." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the lungs. Julian didn't reach for the checkbook. He didn't even blink. He looked down at the hand Arthur had placed on his arm with such intense disdain that my father actually flinched. "Mr. Vance, you are currently attempting to bribe a mandatory reporter in front of 2 law enforcement officers," Julian replied, his voice echoing with a terrifying authority. "That $50,000 would be better spent on a very good criminal defense attorney for your elder daughter, because I have already handed over the forensic photos of the impact site on Cassandra's abdomen. In my professional opinion, a fall doesn't leave a perfect stiletto-shaped hematoma." Before Arthur could retaliate, a young man with a frantic expression pushed his way past the officers. It was Derek Higgins, my closest friend from law school, who had driven 3 hours straight after receiving my garbled text from the car the night before. Derek didn't care about the Vance name or the expensive suits in the room. He walked straight to my side and placed a protective hand on my shoulder. "I'm her legal representative as of 10 minutes ago," Derek announced, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. "Any further communication with my client will go through me. And if you don't step away from her bed right now, I'll add a restraining order to the list of problems you're facing this morning." The officers stepped forward, then their faces grim as they looked at the legal papers Arthur had tried to force me to sign. One of them pulled out a digital recorder and sat down in the chair Julian had vacated. "Ms. Vance, we need your official statement." The officer said, his eyes filled with a rare, genuine sympathy. For the first time in 24 years, the power dynamic in my family shifted. I looked at Eleanor, who was leaning against the wall, looking at me as if I were a traitor, and at Arthur, whose face was turning a sickly shade of gray. I took a deep, shaky breath, ignoring the flare of pain in my gut, and looked the officer in the eye. "My name is Cassandra Vance." I started, my voice gaining strength with every word. "And my sister tried to kill me while my parents watched." The fallout from my formal statement was swifter and more public than I ever could have imagined. While I was still tethered to hospital monitors recovering from the surgery that saved my life, the world of the Vance family began to incinerate under the glare of national media. Sabrina Vance was scheduled to perform at a prestigious international press conference in Manhattan to celebrate her upcoming European tour, a moment my parents had meticulously planned for years. Instead of being greeted by applause, she was met by a swarm of state troopers. The footage went viral within minutes, The piano prodigy, in her silk evening gown, her wrists clamped in cold steel handcuffs, being led away from the podium as cameras flashed like a firing squad. The image of her stunned, arrogant face crumbling into panic became the headline across every major news outlet, tearing the velvet curtain of our family's prestige to shreds. The legal reality set in with a crushing weight that no amount of Vance money could alleviate. Sabrina was officially charged with second-degree assault, a felony in Connecticut, given the severity of my internal injuries and the calculated nature of the attack. But the justice system didn't stop with her. Because of their active efforts to suppress the crime, Arthur and Eleanor Vance found themselves under indictment for obstruction of justice and tampering with a witness. The police reports, bolstered by Dr. Julian Sterling's forensic evidence and the testimony regarding my father's attempted bribe, painted a picture of a family that operated more like a criminal enterprise than a household. Their pristine reputation, which they had valued more than my very breath, was now a toxic brand that donors and galleries scrambled to distance themselves from. However, the most agonizing blow came not from the courts, but from the depths of my parents' unwavering loyalty to their golden child. Even as their assets were being frozen and their social standing dissolved, Arthur and Eleanor decided to launch one final desperate offensive. They emptied their remaining offshore accounts to hire a high-powered defense firm, a group of legal sharks known for victim blaming and character assassination. Instead of seeking a plea deal or asking for my forgiveness, they instructed their lawyers to build a case that painted me as an unstable, jealous sister who had self-inflicted her injuries to sabotage Sabrina's career. I sat in Derek Higgins's office looking at the legal filings where my own mother signed an affidavit claiming I was mentally fragile and prone to hallucinations of grandiosity. This was the peak of their betrayal, a calculated attempt to destroy my future as a lawyer by branding me a liar in a court of law. They were willing to spend every cent they had left, not to help me heal, but to ensure that the person who had nearly killed me walked free. Arthur even went on a televised interview, his voice dripping with faux concern, suggesting that Cassandra's unfortunate accident was being exploited by people with a grudge against his family's success. Watching my father lie to the world while knowing I still had a surgical scar stretching across my abdomen was the moment the last thread of my daughterly devotion finally snapped. The conflict had reached a point of no return. The house in Greenwich was put on the market to fund their legal war, and the once quiet halls of our estate were replaced by the cold, adversarial atmosphere of depositions and hearings. They weren't just my parents anymore. They were my legal opponents, combatants in a war they had started the moment they chose a piano performance over my life. Every motion they filed, every lie they told their attorneys, only served to harden my resolve. I realized then that justice in a family like mine wouldn't be found in a hug or an apology. It would be found in the cold, hard gavel of a judge who didn't care about the Vance name. The heavy mahogany doors of the Superior Court of Connecticut swung shut with a finality that felt like the closing of a dark chapter in my life. The sentencing hearing was a clinical, cold affair, devoid of the grand piano melodies or the champagne toasts that had defined the Vance household. Sabrina Vance sat at the defense table, her designer clothes replaced by a nondescript navy suit, her eyes fixed on the floor as the judge read the verdict. The high-priced lawyers my parents had bankrupted themselves to afford couldn't erase the surgical records or the testimony of Dr. Julian Sterling. For the felony charge of second-degree assault, Sabrina was sentenced to 3 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of intensive probation. As the bailiff led her away, she finally looked at me, but I didn't see the prodigy anymore. I only saw a stranger who shared my DNA. Arthur and Eleanor Vance didn't escape the wreckage either. While they avoided jail time through a plea deal for their obstruction charges, the price they paid was the very thing they loved most, their reputation. The scandal became a landmark case in Greenwich, stripping them of their social standing and their wealth. Their galleries closed, their elite friends vanished, and the grand estate was sold at a loss to pay for legal fees and the massive civil judgment the court awarded to me. As I watched them walk out of the courthouse looking aged and broken, they tried to approach me one last time. My mother started to say something about family loyalty, but I simply held up my hand. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt nothing. I walked past them without a word, knowing that the people who had asked me to bleed in silence no longer had a place in my world. The first thing I did after the trial was sign the papers to legally change my name. I was no longer Cassandra Vance. I took my grandmother's maiden name, a small but powerful act of reclamation. I used the entirety of the settlement money from the civil suit, every single cent, to establish the Sterling Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing legal and medical advocacy for victims of domestic violence who are being silenced by powerful families. Named after the doctor who refused to blink, the foundation became my way of turning a ruptured abdomen into a source of strength for others. I realized that while I couldn't change the family I was born into, I could certainly choose the one I built for myself. Derek Higgins and I graduated law school a year later, and today I work as a public prosecutor focusing on cases where justice is often hidden behind closed doors. My life is quiet now, far removed from the cold perfection of Connecticut mansions and filled with people who value truth over appearances. I haven't spoken to my parents or Sabrina since that day at the courthouse. People often ask if I regret destroying my family, but my answer is always the same. I didn't destroy them. I just stopped helping them hide the fact that they were already broken. Looking back at the girl who crawled out of a window with a ruptured organ, I realized that my survival wasn't a miracle. It was a choice. I chose to believe my life was worth more than a piano career or a family's social standing. To anyone listening who feels trapped in the velvet cage of a toxic family, remember, this family is not a place where you are required to endure suffering in the name of loyalty. It is supposed to be the one place where you are safe, cherished, and protected. If the people who are meant to love you are the ones causing you pain, you have every right to walk away. Do not stay quiet. Do not protect their future at the expense of your own. You are allowed to be your own hero, to break the silence, and to build a life on your own terms. Because at the end of the day, the only reputation that truly matters is the one you have with yourself.